Meredith Calloway Hurst had been living with the consequences of that night for 11 months when Lord Aldrich Vane's housekeeper position fell vacant, and she took it not because she needed the income, she had enough from her late husband's modest estate, but because Dunmore Hall stood 12 miles from anyone who knew what she had done. The bruises were old by then. The ones on her wrists had faded to the yellow-green of old linen, and the one along her left temple had resolved itself into a faint discoloration that she covered each morning with a careful application of rice powder. She had told the solicitor who arranged her employment that she had walked into a doorframe in the dark. He had written it down without looking up. That was the thing about consequences. They were most comfortable when no one examined them too closely. What she had sacrificed was this, her name. Not literally, for she was still Meredith Calloway Hurst, widow of the late Reverend Hurst of Devonshire, but the name as it had meant something. She had signed a document 11 months ago that transferred the deed of her husband's school, a small but respectable institution for the education of young men of modest means, into the hands of a man named Aldous Craven, who had threatened to expose the school's secret debts to the county magistrate unless she complied. The school had educated 30 young men who would have been turned into the street. She had signed. Craven had the deed. The school continued. The young men continued. And Meredith had come north to Dunmore Hall with her carpetbag and her rice powder and her very practiced silence. The hall itself was the kind of house that seemed to have been built in several different centuries by people who disagreed with one another. The east wing was all Georgian restraint, the west wing Baroque excess, and the central portion a sort of compromise that satisfied no one. The gardens had been allowed to grow according to their own preferences for what appeared to be several decades, and the result was a kind of magnificent stubbornness. Roses that had climbed where no one had asked them to climb, yew hedges that had decided to grow sideways, and a wisteria over the servants' entrance that had made a ceiling of itself and seemed rather pleased about it. She had been in residence for 3 weeks before she met the master of the house. She had assumed, from the staff's careful circumspection, that Lord Aldrich Dunmore was either very old, or very ill, or very rude, and had prepared herself for all 3 possibilities. She had not prepared herself for the man who came through the front door on a Tuesday evening in October, just as she was crossing the entrance hall with a ring of keys and a list of things that needed to be inventoried before winter. He was tall in a way that seemed less about height than about presence, the kind of man who made rooms feel smaller, not by filling them, but by making everything else seem less substantial by comparison. His coat was dark, his hair darker, and his face was the sort of face that appeared to have been arranged by someone who had strong opinions about bone structure. He looked, she thought, in the half-second before professional composure reasserted itself, like a portrait of someone who had never been young. "You must be the new housekeeper," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had learned not to carry more than it intended to. "Meredith Calloway Hurst," she said. "I have the household inventory begun. The cellars need attention before the frost, and there are 3 rooms in the east wing where the window seals have failed. I've made a list." She held it out. She had learned, in the 11 months since the document signing, that competence was the best armor. If she was useful, people asked fewer questions. He looked at the list. Then he looked at her. She could not tell precisely what he was looking for. "You are very efficient," he said. "I prefer to be," she said. He handed the list back. "The cellars are my concern. Leave those to me." And he walked past her toward the west wing, and that was the entirety of their first meeting. She thought about it later, not because it had been remarkable, but because of the moment just before he had looked away. There had been a brief unraveling around his eyes. Not recognition, exactly, but the shadow of it. The shape recognition leaves behind when it has come and gone too quickly to be certain of itself. She filed it under things she did not have time to consider, and went back to the inventory. The staff consisted of 4 people: Potts, the elderly groundskeeper who communicated primarily in sighs; Mrs. Fenwick, no, she corrected herself, the woman's name was Mrs. Garth, a stout and comfortable woman who managed the kitchen with the calm authority of someone who had long since made peace with the world's imperfections. a footman named Raleigh, who was young enough to still be surprised by things, and a lady's maid named Birch, who had no lady to attend and had redirected her considerable organizational energies toward the linen cupboards. It was Raleigh who first told her about the portrait. "Third floor of the west wing," he said one morning in November, when she had asked why a particular corridor was kept shuttered. "His lordship keeps it closed, but if you go up there, and I'm not saying you should, there's a portrait of a woman. Been there for as long as anyone can remember. Mrs. Garth says it was there when she came, and she's been here 22 years. Meredith noted this the way she noted everything, precisely, without visible reaction, and with the intention of investigating it when she had a reasonable pretext. The pretext arrived 4 days later in the form of a damp patch on the ceiling of the second-floor corridor, which gave her cause to inspect the room above. She brought a candle and the household notebook, and she was entirely professional about it until she turned and saw the portrait. The woman in it was her. Not her, precisely. The dress was wrong by at least 2 centuries, and the hair was arranged in a style that had not been fashionable since the time of Queen Anne. But the face, the particular angle of the jaw, the way the left eyebrow sat slightly higher than the right, the shape of the mouth, the look in the eyes that Meredith recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning, a look of careful attention, as though the world were a document that required reading before it could be trusted. She stood there for a long time with her candle and her notebook and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. Then she wrote down the dimensions of the damp patch and went downstairs and did not mention the portrait to anyone. That evening, Lord Dunmore found her in the library, where she had been cataloguing a set of household accounts from the previous decade. He came in without knocking, which was his right, and stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way he had, as though he were calculating something. "You went to the West Wing corridor," he said. It was not a question. "There is damp in the ceiling above the second floor," she said. "I have noted it in the maintenance record. The plaster will need attention before spring." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you see the portrait?" She looked up from the accounts. "I did." Another pause. "And?" "And the damp patch is approximately 14 inches in diameter," she said. "I would recommend a roofer be consulted before December." He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him steadily. The candle between them on the desk made the shadows in the room shift very slightly, like something breathing. "You are not going to ask about it," he said. "It is not my house," she said. He left without another word. She went back to the accounts. But her hand, she noticed, was not quite steady, and she had to rewrite the column of figures twice before they came out correctly. December arrived with the particular determination that northern English Decembers have, as though the cold were not a season but a conviction. The hall was draughty in ways that no amount of fires entirely corrected, and Meredith had taken to wearing an extra shawl over her housekeeper's dress and keeping her hands occupied at all times, because occupied hands did not tremble. She had developed, by this point, a working understanding of Lord Dunmore's habits. He rose late. She never heard him before noon. He ate very little at the meals she arranged, and she had noticed that the food returned from his table largely untouched, though he always thanked her for it with a courtesy that seemed genuine rather than performative. He spent his evenings in the library or walking the grounds after dark, and he had a habit of standing very still in doorways before entering rooms, as though listening for something she could not hear. She had also noticed that he never came near the windows during daylight hours. He attributed this when she had once arranged the curtains to let in the winter light, and he had stepped back from it with a visible discomfort, to a sensitivity of the eyes. She had written this down in her private mental inventory under things that did not quite add up, alongside the portrait and the cellars he kept locked, and the fact that Raleigh had once mentioned, in passing, that his lordship had owned Dunmore Hall for longer than any living person could remember. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday morning in December, discussing the Christmas provisions with Mrs. Garth, when the letter arrived. It was from Aldous Craven. She knew the handwriting before she broke the seal, That particular combination of ornate capitals and cramped lower letters, as though the man's vanity and his meanness were at war with each other even on the page. She read it in the kitchen doorway while Mrs. Garth tactfully found reasons to be occupied at the far end of the room. The school, Craven wrote, was to be sold. He had found a buyer, a developer from Manchester who intended to convert the building into a warehouse. The 30 young men currently in residence would be given 1 month to make other arrangements. He was writing to inform her as a courtesy, since she had, after all, been instrumental in the transaction. He hoped she was well. He remained her obedient servant, which was a lie on its face, and she folded the letter very precisely into thirds and put it in her apron pocket and went back to discussing the provisions. She did not weep in the kitchen. She was very careful about that. She wept in the east wing linen cupboard, which was small and smelled of lavender and cedar, and was the most private place in the house she had found. She wept quietly, with the efficiency she brought to everything, and she had stopped and was repairing her composure when she heard him. Lord Dunmore was in the corridor outside the linen cupboard. He had not knocked. There was nothing to knock on, it was a cupboard, but she heard him stop. She heard the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from ordinary human stillness, in a way she had not been able to articulate until this moment. It was the stillness of something that did not need to breathe. "Mrs. Calloway Hurst," he said, through the door. She pressed her hands flat against the shelf of sheets and said, "Yes, my lord? Are you unwell?" "Perfectly well, thank you." A pause. "You have been in there for 11 minutes. She had not known he was counting. She opened the door. He was standing in the corridor with his hands behind his back, and his face arranged in the careful neutrality she had come to recognize as the expression he wore when he was most concerned about something. She was aware that her eyes were red and that the rice powder had not survived. She did not offer an explanation. She simply looked at him and waited. He looked at her face, at the faded marks she had not entirely managed to conceal, at the redness around her eyes, at the set of her mouth, and something happened in his expression that she had no name for. It was not pity. It was older than pity, and it had more weight. "The window seals in the east wing," he said after a moment. "I have arranged for a glazier." "Thank you," she said. "The roofer is coming in January for the damp patch." "Good." He nodded once. "That is all." And he walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment afterward, holding the lavender smell of the linen cupboard in her memory, like something she might need later, and thought that she had never been tended to so obliquely in her life, and that it had been, inexplicably, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 11 months. It was Raleigh who told him. She found this out later, much later, but she reconstructed it from the pieces. Raleigh had seen Craven's letter arrive, had recognized the handwriting from a previous letter that had come in October. Craven had written twice before, shorter letters, which she had answered and not mentioned to anyone, and had, with the loyal indiscretion of the very young, told Lord Dunmore what he knew. She did not know any of this on the evening 3 days later when Lord Dunmore appeared in the doorway of the study where she was working and said, without preamble, "Tell me about the school." She put down her pen. "I beg your pardon?" "The school in Devonshire, the one you signed away. Tell me about it." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Outside, the December wind was doing something complicated with the chimney that made the fire sound as though it were trying to speak. "That is not a matter that concerns the running of this household," she said. "No," he agreed. "It concerns you, which is why I am asking." "My lord, Aldous Craven," he said. "I know the name. I know the man. He has been acquiring properties in the county for the past 2 years, through methods that have brought him before the magistrate on 3 separate occasions, and resulted in nothing, because he is careful and because the people he targets are more frightened of exposure than he is." He paused. "What did he threaten you with?" She looked at the pen in her hand. She had been holding it so tightly that the nib had left a small mark on her finger. "The school had debts," she said at last. My husband, the Reverend Hurst, had borrowed against the property to fund the expansion. He did not tell me. He died before he could tell me. Craven found the records and threatened to take the matter to the magistrate, which would have resulted in the immediate closure of the school and the removal of the students. She set the pen down. I signed the deed. The school continued. That is the entirety of it. And the marks on your face? He said. And your wrists? She was very still. I walked into a door frame. Mrs. Calloway Hurst. In the dark, she said. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She had learned that looking away invited more questions. Craven has a man, he said finally. An agent who visits property owners who are slow to comply. I have heard this. She said nothing. I see, he said, and he left. She sat at the desk for a long time after. The fire spoke to itself in the chimney. She thought about the portrait upstairs, and the woman's eyes in it, and the way Lord Dunmore had looked at her in the corridor outside the linen cupboard. And she thought that she was in a great deal more trouble than she had calculated when she had taken this position, though she could not have said precisely what kind. She discovered what he had done on a Wednesday 2 weeks before Christmas when a letter arrived from Craven's solicitor. It was addressed to her, which was unusual. It informed her, in the careful language of legal correspondence, that the deed she had signed 11 months ago had been the subject of a legal challenge filed on her behalf by a party whose name she was not given, and that the challenge was based on the grounds of coercion, specifically that the signature had been obtained through intimidation, and that evidence of this intimidation had been presented to the county magistrate. The deed, the letter said, was to be considered void pending a hearing. The school was not to be sold. She read the letter twice. Then she went to find Lord Dunmore. She found him in the library, which was where he spent most of his evenings. He was standing at the window, not looking out, because the curtain was drawn, but standing near it in the way he sometimes stood near things he could not quite approach. He turned when she came in. She held up the letter. You did this, she said. I engaged a solicitor, he said, who, without asking me, her voice was very even, she had practiced even, without a word, without a single question about whether I wanted it done. She set the letter on the table between them with a precision that was its own kind of anger. That deed was my choice. I made it with my eyes open. I knew what it cost, and I paid it, and the school continued, and 30 young men did not lose their education. That was my decision. Mine. And you have taken it apart without so much as asking whether I wanted it taken apart. He was quiet. He had the quality, she had noticed, of listening with his whole body rather than just his ears. You are right, he said. She had expected argument. The admission landed strangely. I am also, she said after a moment, aware that what you did may have been done from a reasonable impulse, but that does not make it yours to do. No, he agreed, it does not. He moved away from the window, and she saw that he was choosing his words with the care of someone who had learned, over a very long time, that words said carelessly were very difficult to take back. I saw what Craven had done to you. The marks, the way you hold yourself when you think no one is watching. I have seen that particular kind of careful before, in people who have learned that the wrong movement draws attention. He paused. I reacted. It was not my place to react without your knowledge. No, she said. It was not. They stood on either side of the table with the letter between them. The fire was the only sound in the room. What will happen now? She said. The magistrate's hearing. Craven will contest it, Lord Dunmore said. He has resources and he has used them before. The hearing will require testimony, evidence. He looked at her directly. It will require you to speak about what happened, publicly, before a magistrate, about the debt and about the coercion. She thought about this. She thought about the rice powder and the linen cupboard and the 11 months of practiced silence. She thought about the 30 young men who had continued their education because she had signed a document she should not have signed and said nothing about why. "When is the hearing?" she said. "February," he said, "if you choose to attend." She picked up the letter. She folded it into thirds, the way she always folded things, the way her mother had taught her, precise and economical. "I will need to prepare a statement," she said. He nodded once. "And I will need," she said, "to understand exactly what evidence your solicitor has presented, so that I am not surprised by any of it in the hearing room." "I will arrange a meeting," he said. "Good," she said. She moved toward the door, then she stopped. "Lord Dunmore?" "Yes." "If you intend to do something on my behalf in future," she said, without turning around, "you will ask me first." "Yes," he said. "I will." She left. The letter was still folded in her hand, and she did not unfold it again until she was in her own room, sitting on the edge of the bed, where she read it a third time with the feeling that the ground beneath her was shifting into a new configuration, not better or worse necessarily, but different and requiring new maps. Craven's response to the legal challenge came not through his solicitor, but in person. He arrived at Dunmore Hall on a Friday morning in January, without announcement, in a carriage that was too large for the drive and had to be left at the gate. He was a thick man in his 50s, with the kind of florid confidence that comes from having bullied his way through enough situations to mistake it for competence. He had brought his agent, a lean, silent man named Foss, who stood slightly behind and to the left of him in the way of someone whose function was to be implied rather than stated. Meredith was in the entrance hall when they arrived, because Raleigh had seen the carriage at the gate and had come to find her. And she had decided that she would be the one to meet them rather than have them meet Lord Dunmore first and shape the conversation before she arrived. "Mrs. Hurst," Craven said, coming through the door with the ease of a man who expected doors to open for him. "I thought we might have a word." "Calloway Hurst," she said. "And you may speak in the entrance hall, Mr. Craven. I will not be offering you the use of a sitting room." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who found resistance charming because he had never encountered any that lasted. "You have engaged a solicitor," he said. "That is your right. But I want you to understand something before this goes any further. The school's debts are a matter of public record. Whether the deed stands or falls, those debts exist. A magistrate's hearing will bring them to light. The school's reputation, the reputation your late husband built, will not survive the scrutiny." "My husband's reputation," she said, "is not your concern." "It will become the county's concern," Craven said pleasantly, "when the hearing makes clear that the Reverend Hurst borrowed money he had no means to repay and concealed it from his wife, his board of trustees, and his students' families." He tilted his head. "I am offering you an alternative. Withdraw the challenge. Accept the original arrangement. The school continues under my management, the debts are handled quietly, and no one needs to know anything about any of it." She was aware of Lord Dunmore at the top of the staircase. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on Craven. "The school under your management," she said, "will be sold to a Manchester developer within the year. You told me as much in your December letter. The students will be displaced regardless. The only difference between your offer and the hearing is that your offer also requires me to be complicit in your next deception." Craven's smile became something else. "The hearing will be unpleasant for you." "Most things worth doing are," she said. She heard Lord Dunmore on the stairs. Not his footsteps, because he moved almost without sound, but the slight change in the quality of the air in the room, the way Foss's eyes moved upward and then quickly away. "Mr. Craven," Lord Dunmore said from the foot of the stairs, "you are in my house without invitation. You have 1 minute to leave before I send for the magistrate to remove you, at which point your visit will become a matter of record that your solicitor will find difficult to explain." Craven looked between them. He was calculating, she could see. calculating whether the threat was real, whether the magistrate would come, whether Lord Dunmore's name carried enough weight in the county to make this a fight he did not want. He decided it did. "We will speak at the hearing," Craven said to her. Not to Lord Dunmore, to her, which she noted. He was telling her that she was the one he considered the obstacle. She found this, despite everything, a kind of compliment. He left. Foss followed, the door closed. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment, listening to the carriage wheels on the frozen gravel, and then she turned to Lord Dunmore. "He will prepare," she said. "He will have witnesses." "So will we," Lord Dunmore said. "Who?" she said. "The only person who witnessed the coercion is me, and Foss, who will not testify against his employer." Lord Dunmore was quiet for a moment. "There are others," he said. "Other property owners Craven has approached through similar methods. I have been making inquiries." He paused. "With your permission." She looked at him. The emphasis on the last three words was deliberate, and they both knew it. "With my permission," she said. "Yes. Continue the inquiries." The weeks before the February hearing had the quality of a held breath. The solicitor came twice, a precise man from York named Alderton, who asked questions with the efficiency of someone who valued answers over comfort, and who seemed to find Meredith's directness a relief rather than an inconvenience. She gave her statement in the library at Dunmore Hall, with Lord Dunmore present because she had asked him to be, and Alderton, who was too professional to show surprise, wrote everything down. It was during the second meeting with Alderton that she asked the question she had been holding for 2 months. "The portrait," she said, "in the West Wing corridor. Who is she?" Alderton looked at Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore looked at her. "Her name was Elspeth Holt," he said. "She lived in this house in 1687. She was the daughter of the previous owner." "She looks like me," Meredith said. "Yes," he said, "she does." "You knew her." It was not a question. She had been assembling the pieces for 2 months. The portrait, Raleigh's comment about how long Lord Dunmore had owned the hall, the way he moved through the house as though he had memorized it across a span of time that ordinary people did not have access to, the way he had looked at her on the first evening in the entrance hall, that shadow of recognition that had come and gone too quickly to be certain of. He looked at her for a long moment. Alderton had found something very interesting to examine in his notebook. "Yes," Lord Dunmore said. "And you loved her," she said. Another pause. "Yes." She nodded. She had known this. In the way that one knows things one has been carefully not thinking about. "And when you look at me," she said, "what do you see?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I see someone who signed a document to protect 30 strangers and came north to be invisible about it. I see someone who weeps in linen cupboards and calls it being perfectly well. I see someone who told a man to leave her house with more composure than most people bring to ordering tea." He paused. "I see you, Mrs. Calloway Hurst. I am aware of the resemblance. I am also aware that it is a resemblance and nothing more." Alderton closed his notebook. "I believe I have everything I need," he said, and excused himself with the tact of someone who had learned to recognize the moments when the room needed fewer people in it. When he was gone, the library was very quiet. Outside, January was doing what January does, pressing its cold patience against the windows and waiting. "How long?" she said. He understood the question. "Since 1643, he said. She absorbed this. "And the portrait was painted?" 1689, he said. 2 years after she died. I commissioned it from memory." She looked at the fire. She thought about a man sitting in this house for 200 years with a portrait on the 3rd floor of the West Wing, and the particular kind of careful that came from having learned that attachment had costs he was not willing to pay again. She thought about the way he had stood near the window without approaching it. She thought about the cellars he kept locked and the meals he did not eat, and the stillness that was different from human stillness. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." "Why didn't you?" He looked at the fire as well. "Because the last time I told someone," he said, "it was Elspeth, and she was not frightened, and I loved her for it. And she died, as people do, and I did not, as I do not, and I have spent a considerable number of years concluding that the kindest thing I can do for people I am inclined to care about is to not tell them anything that makes caring more complicated." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the fire. His profile in the firelight had the quality of the portrait upstairs, something that had been rendered with great care by someone who had felt the subject very deeply. "That is," she said carefully, "the most elaborately self-defeating logic I have encountered in recent memory." He turned to look at her. The geometry of his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the suggestion of what a smile would be if it were allowed to happen. "The hearing is in 3 weeks," she said. "Yes." "After the hearing," she said, "I would like to have a proper conversation about all of this. Not now. Now I need to think about Craven and the magistrate and the statement." She stood. "But after," he agreed. She went to the door. Then she stopped, because she had a habit of stopping in doorways when there was something left to say. "The portrait," she said, "I would like it moved, not destroyed. Moved. Somewhere it is not on the 3rd floor of the West Wing gathering dust, as though it were a memorial." She paused. "She deserves better than a memorial. And so do I." She left him with that, and went to bed, and slept better than she had in 11 months. The hearing before the county magistrate took place on a cold Tuesday in February, in a room that smelled of old paper, and the particular anxiety of people who had been waiting in it for a long time. Craven arrived with his solicitor and 2 witnesses Meredith did not recognize. She arrived with Alderton and Lord Dunmore, and, this was the part she had not anticipated, 3 other individuals whom Alderton had located in the preceding weeks: a widow from Harrogate, a retired schoolmaster from Ripon, and a farmer from the edge of the moor, all of whom had received visits from Craven or his agent in the past 4 years, and all of whom had, separately and in private, agreed to speak. She gave her statement first. She had written it out and memorized it, and she delivered it in the same voice she used to discuss window seals and cellar inventories, precise even, without decoration. She described the debt, the threat, the document, and the marks on her wrists and temple, which she had not covered with rice powder that morning for the first time in 11 months. She described them calmly, as evidence, which was what they were. Craven's solicitor attempted to suggest that the debt had been real, and the deed a reasonable settlement. The widow from Harrogate then described a remarkably similar transaction involving her late husband's mill. The retired schoolmaster described another. The farmer described a third. Alderton presented documents. The magistrate, a dry and thorough man named Forsyth, who had clearly seen enough of Craven's methods to have formed a view, listened to everything with the attention of someone taking very careful notes. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The deed was voided. Craven was referred to the Crown's legal office for further examination of his acquisition practices. Foss, who had apparently decided that loyalty to Craven was less valuable than he had previously estimated, provided a written account that Alderton produced at the final moment with the timing of someone who had been saving it for exactly that purpose. It was not a triumph in the way that triumphs are usually described. It was more like the correction of an error, the satisfaction of a ledger that had been wrong for 11 months finally balancing. The school would need a new board of trustees and a proper accounting of its finances. The debts were real and would need to be addressed through legitimate means. None of this was resolved in the hearing room. But the deed was gone, and Craven was gone, and she stood on the courthouse steps in the February cold and felt the particular lightness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Lord Dunmore was beside her on the steps. He did not say anything. He handed her gloves, which she had left on the bench inside, and she put them on, and they stood together in the cold for a moment while Alderton gathered his papers and the other witnesses dispersed. "The school will need oversight," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was a trustee before I signed the deed," she said. "The board was dissolved when Craven took the property. It will need to be reconstituted." Tsa.